Mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. We are live. I am reading Spare the Kids Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. Tonight we are on chapter 3, Extending the Master's Lash. Chapter 1 was a family conversation. Chapter 2 was a love whooping, reflections on the Adrian Peterson and Baltimore mom controversies. And tonight it is chapter 3, Extending the Master's Lash, the historical roots of whooping children in black communities. One of the saddest untold stories in American history is the ways that its victims of racial oppression and violence have hurt the bodies of their own children in an effort to protect them from a hostile society. While physical punishment is so deeply rooted in the American way of raising kids, history provides a clear explanation for why so many black people embrace this harsh form of discipline while falsely believing that whooping children is something uniquely black. Looking to the past can help us understand how and why this society, which intentionally chips away at the vitality of black life, continues to demand this vicious cycle of abuse against black children, even as it disproportionately criminalizes us for doing it. The fact is, white America has long derived power from assuring that black children are victims of physical, intellectual, psychological, and spiritual violence, and that the people raising them are complicit in their abuse. This is what white supremacy requires. Indeed, black folks have imported violence into our culture by embracing the idea that whooping our children will garner freedom and acceptance from white America and usher our communities into safety and prosperity. It's never worked. So then how did this violent child rearing practice become so deeply implanted in our culture? Why do so many of us believe that if we spare the rod, then all hell will break loose? Or that we will lose our black card or dishonor the legacy of our loving elders who whipped us so we wouldn't grow up to smoke crack, be a welfare queen, go to jail, or worse? We must journey through a few historical time periods to lay the foundation for understanding why whooping children is a practice that did not begin with us, but got etched into the DNA of our bodies, memory, and culture, even as white America gradually moves away from this kind of violence when it comes to their own children. Hitting and abusing children has a long history that's been part of virtually every culture and every society dating back to biblical times. The Bible itself is full of scriptures sanctifying child abuse. Think about Abraham, who nearly sacrificed his only son as a test of his faith in God. King Herod massacred innocent babies in a failed attempt to kill Jesus. Lot had drunken sex with his daughters. Young female sex abuse victims were required to marry their rapist. God sent 2 bears to murder 42 kids who made fun of Elijah's baldness. Let's not forget Psalm 137:9, which praises the bashing of the heads of babies to prevent the rise of a new generation of Babylonians. For 2,000 years of European history, going all the way back to the Greeks, whose worldview can be seen within modern Christianity, adults deliberately exploited, tortured, raped, and killed their own children. Lloyd de Mouse, the controversial psychologist and historian, wrote, "The history of childhood is a nightmare from which we have only begun to awaken. The further back in history one goes, the lower the level of child care, and the more likely children are to be killed, abandoned, beaten, terrorized, and sexually abused." For the most part, DeMouse and other scholars have painted a dark and horrifying picture of childhood in Western societies. European parents beat their young with cat-o'-nine-tails, shovels, canes, iron rods, and sticks. Infanticide was common and unpunished due to poverty, the need to limit family size or to eliminate political rivals, and because people believed that physically or mentally disabled children were the handiwork of the devil. During antiquity and the Middle Ages, about half of babies born were killed by their caretakers, and not just by poor parents. The ruling elites had just as high rates of child killings. Children were burned, shaken, tossed about, and flung into rivers, trenches, and heaps of animal manure. They were also intentionally starved, castrated, thrown into fires by their parents as sacrifices to gods, cooked and eaten as part of fertility rites, fed poisons that plastered their insides, rolled in snow until they froze to death, sealed into the walls and foundations of bridges and buildings, and abandoned on hillsides and roads where birds, dogs, and wild beasts scavenged and devoured unlikely waifs. In ancient Greece, a disobedient son could lose his tongue, eye, or fingers. Greek infants born with deformities were considered unfit to be raised and thus killed in order to preserve ideal racial characteristics. Young boys and girls suffered routine sexual molestation by older men. A young person could be kept as a pet child for entertainment and pedophilic gratification, or sold into slavery or hard labor by a parent as payment for collateral or debts. Even as late as the 19th century, American medical journals reported regular findings of sexually transmitted diseases on children's anuses, genitals, and mouths when their parents had the disease. From royals to regular folks, centuries of Europeans grew up with severe beatings as being a regular part of a child's life. This is of little surprise given the dominant beliefs. According to some historians, the modern version of childhood is a distinct and bound phase of life, one of innocence and isolation from violence, did not begin to significantly take root in Europe until the early 1600s. Before that, many children generally did not have the right to be free from violence. That right was granted only to adults, because adults defined themselves as free and moral against the unfree, immoral, and criminal young. Countless diaries, letters, autobiographies, and medical reports detail routine mistreatment of children throughout history. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all European children suffered abuse, or that all European mothers and fathers from the past parented with hardened, sadistic hearts. Parents across different cultures and times, whether they were German, British, French, or Greek, loved their children, displayed tenderness, worried about them, and showed interest in the stages of their development. Some even advocated for humane treatment of the young. At the same time, many European parents also lacked the capacity to respond to their children's developmental behaviors with empathy. As DeMouse explained, it is, of course, not love which the parent of the past lacked, but rather the emotional maturity needed to see the child as a person separate from himself. Naturally, this harsh mistreatment of children, along with the desire for land, profit, fame, and a religious zeal to civilize and convert the poisoned souls of native people to Christianity, bred a culture of adult violence, which drove conquest, colonization, slavery, and genocide. In fact, these practices were rationalized through seeing Africans and indigenous peoples as children whom they felt free to brutalize, rape, and kill. As a result, for white kids, a different worldview developed. By the 17th century, white children were slowly categorized as innocent, and therefore entitled to claim rights against the violent treatment that was endemic to childhood periods before then. By the 19th century, with changing attitudes about children's welfare, beatings gradually decreased for white children, although it did not disappear. It turned into a milder form of punishment called spanking. For centuries, childhood for Europeans was a period of systemic violence, labor exploitation, enslavement, and sexual abuse. But when Europeans sought to enslave Africans, they imposed the category of child on them and modeled their racist system of exploiting black bodies on the long-standing ideologies of childhood and the brutal treatment of children in order to justify their enslavement. By the 17th century, a separate and unequal definition of childhood gained traction, with a childlike status encapsulating the permanent inferiority and savagery of blackness. In other words, white people began to recognize the vulnerability of their own children and had to rescue them, if only partially, from this unthinkable close proximity to blackness and the brutality of childhood. White adults began to reconceptualize white childhood as a newly developed space of innocence, promise, and security. As such, white children were imagined as partial adults who could be gradually guided out of savagery and into whiteness by being educated and perfected to their highest potential, and afforded special protections because they would mature into future beneficiaries of white civilization. Black slaves, on the other hand, even in adulthood, were by definition irredeemable, wild animals and eternal children, whose bodies were always ready sites for exploitation, control, and brutal treatment. The only people who are fully categorized as children today are also radicalized. In other words, there is no such thing as a white child. There's only whiteness, which is always a form of privileged adulthood. Likewise, there is no such thing as a black adult. There's only blackness, which is always a form of dehumanized childhood. And so the bodies of underage and adult blacks occupy the same unprotected space of childhood and continue to be subjugated to the same racist violence. In other words, black children are exempt from the protections of young people should be granted to play, run, get dirty, and make mistakes. Their innocence is denied and negated as they are viewed as stereotyped black adults, and they are treated accordingly in schools, in public spaces, and sadly within their own families. Long before the first Europeans landed on this continent to build a model Christian nation, they had grown accustomed to doling out sexual and physical violence against their own children, who they regarded as savages. That brutality cascaded across generations and continents, and got transferred into other cultures through slavery and colonialism. While white people gradually began sparing sparing their own children from brutality, it shouldn't be surprising then that traumatized black people in America eventually inherited their oppressors' violence and carried it forward in much the same way to their children. When the Puritans sailed from Great Britain and arrived in the forests of New England in the early 1600s, they were not only survivors of religious persecution, but also a culture of profound child abuse that isn't part of our Thanksgiving narratives. This history of abuse may explain why they were also violent with one another, with indigenous communities, and with enslaved Africans. This group of separatists from the Church of England came to America to begin new lives and establish new colonies and cultures. They sailed the ocean blue with their generously inherited traumas, Christian and white supremacist worldviews, and a strong belief that children were potential threats to the social order. Beatings rather than nurturing parenting were needed in preparation for citizenship and salvation. Ambitious and self-righteous in ways that would make Donald Trump proud, the Puritans brought disease, love of warfare, and a delusional belief that God had chosen them to inherit an already occupied land. They initially regarded the millions of indigenous peoples already living on this land as the lost children of God who could be brought out of ignorance to benefit from a higher civilization. They believed they had been touched by God to create a city upon a hill, founded on biblical teachings. This preordained manifest destiny of theirs and of other European settlers and their descendants was to be achieved by stealing the continent and bringing the so-called gifts of democracy, civilization, and Christianity to people of color. All right, I yawned twice, so I'm out. I'll see y'all tomorrow. We're going to keep going with chapter 3.